Hello and welcome. I didn't expect such a big crowd. It's amazing on a glorious day with so much to do to have you all here. My name is Elena Filipovic. I'm the current director of Kunsthalle Basel. But I'm here in this institution because this is actually the place where I did my very first exhibition in the region, Basel Rien. And I'm here to speak a bit about that project and its various iterations, but most notably as well to celebrate the book that has just come out, the very big, very heavy, book that has come out to document it, to commemorate it, to try to explain it a bit. I thank the Fondation Beyeler and the whole team for making it possible for me to be here and to have such an esteemed fellow traveler in this project with me. Maybe by way of a short introduction, I will introduce my conversation partner, who probably needs no introduction, but nevertheless, Tino Sehgal studied political economy and dance at Humboldt University, Berlin, and Volkswagen University of the Arts in Essen. He's been the subject of numerous solo exhibitions internationally, including amongst the most recent at the Martin Gropiusbau in Berlin in 2015, at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, also in 2015, and the Palais de Tokyo in 2016. Through November 12th of this year, Tino Sehgal's exhibition, which is designed as a series of 6 successive presentations, will be on view here at the Fondation Beyeler. Now, maybe to frame a bit today's discussion, I should say a few words about the exhibition, about which the book pays tribute. It was called Felix González Torres, Specific Objects Without Specific Form. And it was a retrospective of Felix González Torres's work. It was a project I did when I was a new curator at the Wheels Center for Contemporary Art in Brussels. When I arrived, my director had asked me specifically to work on a retrospective of Felix's work, which I was honored and intimidated to do. But once I began thinking about and researching and learning more about Felix's work, the true nature of the task put before me became even more daunting. Now, I'll give you maybe just a few really small examples that illustrate the problem that I had before me. When I was reading interviews and essays and everything I could find about Felix González Torres, I realized that, for instance, when he taught photography courses in New York, which he did for a number of years, one of the first lessons he would give his students would be to send them home, not to come back the next day with a photograph or an idea for a work, but rather with a page from the New York Times, where they could show that there was an article or information that was untrue. Now, we have to put this in the context of the 90s, before fake news was evident and clear. And already then, Felix González Torres was making his students realize that maybe the first important task as an artist was first to be critical, was first to question authority, was first to know that maybe the things we're told, even in the New York Times, could have a falsehood embedded in them. And he gave a lecture to fellow artists and art lovers in New York. And one of the things he said in the course of his lecture was he started talking about the dictionary as a form of literature, not a tool, but a form of literature. And he explained that we have to think of the dictionary as something that was written by someone at a certain moment, with a certain gender, from a certain place, that has every bit as much of interpretation as any other piece of literature, and thus can't be taken as a neutral authority. There were many other stories like that, but there are the works also. think of his candy piles or his paper piles and the way that they put in question the ultimate authority of the form of an object because they get undone or changed over the course of an exhibition, or the form that an artist is supposed to give when they sort of set a work in motion and leave it in the exhibition, but it's changing over its course. Or even the authority of an institution, which normally would be a place where people look but don't touch, definitely don't eat, definitely don't take home. And so he put on various levels, through many ways in his work, authority in question. And when I realized that, I thought it felt like an anomaly, or maybe the wrong thing to do, to create a retrospective that would be authoritative, that would be definitive, that would say these 40 works in this particular order would be the sort of iconic image we should have of Félix González Torres. I began to think that maybe a retrospective was not the right thing to do. And thankfully, my director didn't let me get away with not doing it. But he pressed on and said that I simply had to find a way to do this retrospective in a way that honored the work. And the way that I found, after much reflection, to honor the work was to invite artists, to talk to them about who Félix was for them. And I specifically sought out artists who hadn't known Félix, like I hadn't known Félix. Artists who had never seen an installation that Félix himself had done, but who had been imprinted in their own thinking, in their own lives, in their own work, with the importance of his thinking, maybe even influenced in their own practices by his work. And I talked to a number of artists, but it was very convenient that Tino lived on my street in Berlin. But of course, it's not just convenience that brought me to him, but maybe most importantly, I had a doubt that, to be honest, that Tino would be at all interested in Félix González Torres' work, because I knew, and I just read you the biography of Tino, that he'd come from dance, he'd come from political economy, he hadn't come from art training, from the place that usually young artists are indoctrinated and explained the work of various other figures that become important to them. So I didn't know what he thought of Félix's work. But I had a suspicion, given how important questioning the art object was, given how important questioning the contract is, thinking about the transaction of an artwork, I suspected that he should be someone I should talk to. Even if he weren't interested in Félix, I wanted to know why, or what impact or information he had about Félix's work. I spoke to 3 artists in particular in the preparations for the exhibition, because in the process of thinking about the project, I realized maybe the only way to make an exhibition that would be not authoritative would be not to make one exhibition, not to make a definitive show that would declare that these were the important works of Félix González Torres in this way, choreographed or presented like that. So I decided that it should be a show that would travel. It originated at Wheels in Brussels. It then came to the Fondation Beyeler, and then went on to the MMK in Frankfurt, the Museum for Moderne Kunst. And at each venue, I decided, instead of having just one version of the exhibition, I would set up a show, my version of what I thought a Félix González Torres retrospective might or should look like. And I invited an artist. At Wheels, I invited Jan Vaux to take down my exhibition halfway through the duration and to reinstall it in his own way, with his own selection of work. And it was very important that the artists would have the possibility to decide which works they considered important or not, or the ones that should be shown in a retrospective or not. Here at the Fondation Beyeler, I worked with Carol Bove, who also reinterpreted, looked at what I had done, made her own version with her own selection of work, her own protocol. And at the MMK, I worked with Tino Sehgal, who made the pinnacle or the end point of the exhibition, perhaps also the show that became the most complex to explain, with the most number of moving parts. And so it thrills me in all the conversations or thinking that I've had about the exhibition and this book that now attempts in some way to document these 6 versions of a Felix González Torres retrospective, to be with him, because it's the first time that we've had the first chance to speak after that project about how it is he came to thinking about making his version of the show as he did. Now, maybe before I get him to tell you all, but also to tell me about a reflection that comes after the fact of doing it, I will say that each of the artists made a proper retrospective of Felix González Torres's work, but inevitably each of those retrospectives is a kind of mirror or a reflection on their own thinking and their own practices. And so I know that while I was working with and talking to Tino about what he was preparing as his version, in my head I couldn't help thinking of his own practice and the different things that, the way that maybe in time his exhibition would be read not only as an exhibition of Felix González Torres, but that people would be reading it through the lens of works like the pieces you see here at the Fondation Beyeler. Maybe I'll say one last thing, which is I know in our early conversations about the exhibition, one of the things that inspired me very much in my thinking about giving me the authority, in a way, to do the show as I did, I thought a lot about Felix's exhibition. Every week there's something different. And when we began talking, Tino, that was an important conversation, that Felix had organized an exhibition, his first big gallery show in New York in 1991, and he called it Every Week There's Something Different, with, as the title implies, every week a changing constellation of works. That was sort of one of our important starting points in the conversation. Maybe you can tell us about how you came to and what you did for those who didn't manage to see that version of the retrospective.
Thank you, Elena. Yeah, I think that for me, first of all, like when you invited me, it's a little bit like, as an artist, I mean, it's not the first time somebody asked me, like, do you want to have a show with like just you and another artist, you know? And it's always a little bit like you kind of get married in public or something. And I was like, okay, I'm not really a curator, but I'm fine with González Torres. Like, he is really an important part of my lineage. I mean, I always say, like, you have the official lineage, the one that you kind of decide upon as a grown-up, and then you have the unofficial lineage of some random people who actually influenced you, which you wouldn't say in public, you know, like, and my official lineage, the unofficial I can tell you later at the bar or something, but the official lineage would be something like Watteau, Seurat, probably Duchamp, Buren, González Torres, you know, something like that, maybe Kuhn somewhere in the middle. And I mean, on the visual art side, and there's obviously the dance side, for me very strongly, with people like Balanchine or Forsyth or Xavier Leroy. And so, first of all, I was like, okay, like, I can do this. Like, I can stand by that in public. That's why I'm happy to be here. And I think you did an amazing, beautiful book. And I like to gift it also to people I like, because I think it is really beautiful. And in terms of Felix, the reason why Felix González Torres' work was important to me is because exactly also what you say in the title of your show, specific objects without specific form. So like the fact that like my works change all the time, and he's maybe the first person in visual art who makes really visual artworks that are kind of to experience as processual. If you take candy away, you know, like, it's a different, and you eat the candy or whatever, like, it's a different work. And over time, it really changes. If you come back to the show, you see the pile is diminished, or you take a poster, it was like part of one context in the show. Suddenly you see it in, you know, in people's hallways as a kind of singular thing. So that was also something that was interesting to me, which maybe I haven't achieved as well as he has, like, where like things have different functions in different contexts, you know, like, so, or work different in different contexts, although they're literally the same thing. So, but, so for me it was interesting that he really but I think the most interesting thing for me about González Torres was his craft. That, like, to me, he was somebody who constructed situations much more than just producing an object. Like, when you're in front of his works, like, there's a real kind of experiential kind of dilemma or questioning happens. I remember in 2001, I showed in Museum Ludwig in a room with like Robert Morris and Félix González Torres, and like, normally it's like, okay, like, I always have a little bit of an advantage because like, I've got a human presence, which is energetically much stronger than like an object. So I'm used to getting the attention also somehow. That wasn't intentional, but I realized that over time. But I realized like González Torres, like people really, that was strong competition because like people are in front of these passports, these stacks of passports, which are highly seductive and beautiful, and they're really like wondering, can I take one? Because there's no mention that you can take one or that you can take one, but somehow the way he's presented them in this like stack on the floor kind of suggests to people that you could. And that, I think, is in terms of mise en scène, in terms of composing an exhibition, of placing something in an exhibition, actually much more difficult to do than it sounds. To give this message, like to give an actual experiential kind of shift to the situation, like without saying, please take one, it's like presenting something in a way that, like, obviously you never take something in an exhibition. And so beyond that, the other important thing is that all the kind of like experiential dilemma which comes with that people are like, I want to take it, seductive, it seems like I can take it, but wait, I'm in a museum, like I can't just take an object in a museum, but this is just a little paper thing, and they're like, kind of, and so people are really like busy, like in a moment, and I was like, wow, like he's really constructing a specific situation through objects, and so that was something that I really respected, and something obviously I wanted to do, and or was already doing. And but like with this, I don't think he managed to do it on the level of exhibition. So the show that you just mentioned, Elena, of like every week the show will be different, like it was, you couldn't actually experience that really when you came to the show. Like you would come to Andrea Rosen Gallery in 1991 with like one show, and probably wouldn't come back the next week. So the whole concept for the show I did for you in Frankfurt was that like you can actually experience, like you have a very specific experience when you're in front of these kind of stacks or candy piles, that you actually experience this kind of changing of the show, and it's not just an idea of changing, you know, which to me would be my critique of this. Every week the show will be different show in 91. So what I did, and that's, I think the González Torres Foundation made a big effort in kind of documenting it, is I actually did 7 shows. And the 7 shows would show also González Torres in his kind of variety. For example, there was one show which only consisted of light strings. Like, and all the other works were gone. There was one show which like focused on his like political, like his works which were explicitly political. Then there was like a third show which was like kind of Félix González Torres as a kind of minimal sculptor, like, and so there were 7 of these, and then there were like 2 art handlers at the time, at every moment, and who were like just changing this show leaf, like let's say from first version, maybe this like political show, to the next version, which was maybe then this minimal show, yeah. And so they wouldn't be like under stress or something. They would just be in one room, wherever you would go, you would see them kind of. Let's see, maybe I can show you a photo later, but see if I can do 2 things at the same time. But
maybe so people understand, actually.
Yeah.
What
like, you see them do this, like taking off the perfect lovers and putting it somewhere.
You have to imagine 7 shows in one place at one time.
Yeah. And so basically, if you like if you'd stay around 7 hours, you would see also these 7 shows passing through. It would never be like a kind of fixed point or something. They would, when they would set up one show, I think they would walk one round, have a cigarette, because they all like to smoke, these art handlers. So there was a balcony also with a nice kind of González Torres curtain. When they would open the window, smoke, then the curtain would blow a bit, and then they would continue. Yeah, so it was very like kind of continuous project, altered continuously. Yeah. And yeah, in the book, yeah, I mean, like I said, like in the book you see the whole, they made a point of kind of having these floor plans and all these photos of like what each of these 7 shows was. And you also have beautiful photos of my old friend Anne Imhoff, who was one of the art handlers. You're doing a show with her, no? You did?
Last summer.
Last summer, yeah.
So one has to imagine that if this retrospective in its totality was actually a show divided between 3 venues, and at each venue was actually made up of 2 shows, not one show taken down by an artist and then reinstalled as their own version, Tino took it to its furthest possible conclusion by not making 1 show, but 7. And as he explained, he designed these 7 shows, sort of trained art handlers who were art students at the Städelschule, and then had them sort of install constantly in the state of installing and deinstalling his version of a Felix González Torres retrospective.
Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah, so it was basically also to say 7 shows is in a way also not totally correct, because basically it was one continuously shifting show. And it was shifting slowly, so I still wanted it to be like an exhibition. So it wasn't like everywhere somebody's like kind of spectacularly kind of dismantling something. Basically you would walk through this like, you know, the MMK is this like weird kind of piece of cake in terms of its like floor plan. And you would walk, and you can walk kind of in a circle through this, like in a you know, all rooms kind of connect with each other. So you'd see in one of these, like, I don't know, 13 rooms or however many it was, like you'd see somebody working on something, like, but then what people ended up doing was also just like going for a coffee after they'd visit the show. Did you hear this? That they would go for a coffee and then they would go back up. And that was apparently fun, because then it was really quite drastically different, you know, by the time you had the coffee. Like, it was, yeah.
I also heard that there's quite a few people who had the experience. You have to imagine that the MMK has something like 12 rooms that are sort of each leading on to the other. So imagine you're a visitor to the exhibition, you walk in to a room which is perfectly set up like an exhibition. You go to the next room, you're continuing in your walk through a Felix González Torres retrospective. You get to room 3, everything's okay. Room 4, you suddenly see installers in the state with their ladders, you know, taking something down. And we had many visitors who just thought, oh, the show's not yet open, or they need help. So we had visitors that were actually getting involved in pushing candy around or lifting, you know, paper stacks, thinking like, crap, these poor installers, they're not ready for the exhibition. But then they would go to the next room and it would be set up like an ordinary exhibition again. And so as they circled around, it might take a while for them to realize that it was a show in constant state of alteration, because the installers were working one room at a time. The installers also worked with Tino to kind of invent their own methods for sort of moving things. They invented various devices to properly, easily push along, shovel candy or paper. But maybe it's important to say that such a show is possible or conceivable, imaginable, only because the work of Felix González Torres, unlike most artists, is not just either paintings or sculptures or photographs put on a wall, but rather inherent in each of the works themselves, Now, there are some pieces which have a kind of formal stability to them. They are photographs that get hung on the wall normally. But there are many what are called manifestable works, works made up of candy piles, paper piles, light strings, clocks, elements that have in their contract, and as an installer, as a museum director, as a curator, as a lender, as a purchaser of a work, you would receive the contract. And in the contract, it would explain not only the dimensions of the work, the materials of the work, and how it can be manifested or made, but also what parameters there are, often very wide ones, for how it can be shown. So although we often see a certain candy pile that ended up looking again and again the same, because maybe in a catalogue raisonné for Felix González Torres, one of the complexities or problems I found was there was often a work description and one photograph. And anyone going to the catalogue raisonné would think that's what that candy pile looks like, or that's what that light string looks like. But actually, when you read the contract, you realize that the responsibility, the ultimate responsibility for how it should be installed, what decisions which make up everything to do about how it looks formally, is in the hands of the buyer, the lender, the institution, the installer, the curator. And it was for this reason, precisely, that asking artists to think about how to install Felix González Torres' work, or even asking someone else, meant that you could say the same work that was in my show, and we did have quite some overlaps between our shows, but they looked radically different between the way I had chosen to show a work and the way that Tino had. And exactly this room for interpretation is built into the work.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, that and something that I was also interested in, that this whole malleability and this whole kind of giving over the responsibility to the buyer, to the institution, to the curator, was something which wasn't really experienceable. Can you say that? Like, one couldn't experience that normally, because it was like people would make the decision, and then if you really knew González Torres' work, you'd see, well, maybe it's a little bit different in the next place. So I wanted to make that aspect of the work kind of visible, no? And obviously that's only really possible with his work. And then another thing was that all of his works are actually untitled. So I had like some conversations with Andrea Rosen about that, because I said, well, if they're untitled, they're untitled. That means that we don't have to put labels, because of course the whole show was only really possible, if we would have to always shift the labels around, that would have also, been a bit difficult, and also wouldn't have looked really good, and a whole nother thing to do. But I said, well, but they are untitled. Then he also has these bracketed titles like, Portrait of Dad, or Ross in LA, or whatever it is. But I was like, but I'm not so interested in his personal life and however he tries to remember these kind of bracketed titles. So I said, let's take him at face value. If they're untitled, you don't need to know a title. So you just experience the work. And that also made it much easier to kind of just move the stuff around.
But that's interesting, because that's maybe a decision that an artist would dare to do, that maybe an institutional curator, I would sort of never have thought to or dared to not have labels, because it felt like I had a certain historical responsibility. I also conceived my selection really with the weight of history on my shoulders and trying to show a progression in Felix González Torres' work. I showed his very first paper stack and how it was on a pedestal, because I wanted to show that actually he was already at that moment, or still at that moment, engaging with the history of conventional sort of painting and sculpture, and then makes the move to bring the paper stacks to the floor without a pedestal. They become the pedestal. And I know in the conversation I had with Jan Vo, for instance, it was exactly that early work of Felix González Torres that he didn't want to show in his version of the retrospective, because he said for him, that was Felix González Torres had not yet arrived at what we think of as Felix González Torres. So my Felix and Jan Vo's Felix was very different, and my Felix and Tino's Felix was also different, because there were certain things you were clearly interested in. And I would love to speak also to your selection, because a curatorial job is not just about how do you install the work or what protocol do you give, but how do you select what goes into a retrospective? And you had very clear ideas about which Felix works you wanted.
Did I?
Yeah, you did.
So many years ago.
I remember specifically you were looking at questions of economics, which makes sense given your background.
I mean, you remember more than me, but I think like
And America.
Yeah?
Also.
I think that, I mean, what I remember is obviously that I was interested in these works which can change, because that's my kind of, related to my question. Like, I think that, if you look at the 19th century, just economically or historically, also the 20th century, you could say it's like the age of the product. And what is actually a product? A product is something that comes at the end of a production process, And the 19th century and the 20th century really kind of were obsessed, you can say, if you think of all the big kind of world fairs and stuff like that. Like in the 19th century, we'd have like this plethora of objects, and people were just like kind of in this kind of high of like, that's a very, in terms of civilization, human history, like a very new thing that human societies can kind of produce all these products, and then they would be like displayed, and that was what society was busy with until, like I say, the late 20th century, of like producing all these products. So it's no coincidence that, let's say, in our temples, museums, they are full of these products, But if you look at economy and society today, if you think of the service industry, which is like, I think, at least in Europe, like the biggest economic sector. If you look at like social media, it's like very processual. Like, so how do you kind of present or to me, this age of the product is kind of over. It's obviously we have a lot of products, but it's not at the forefront of what we're doing today as a society. We're much more in a kind of processual thing. So González Torres, for me, is like the artist who really manages. He's like at the historical. He's like almost like portraying this historical shift. Yes, like he takes up these static minimal objects like a Carl Andre, or like a kind of like a minimal cube, and then he shifts them into being a process. That's, I think, his mastery. And so that, I think, was my biggest concern. And then, of course, I wanted to do 7 different shows, so I needed to include stuff. Like I did one show, now I remember, one show was called, wasn't called, but like one of the 7 shows in our internal lingua was called, I think, like Political or something. And that was a lot of his stuff about America, And, but for me, I don't know if America was now so much my concern. It was more that, like, I wanted to, like, in terms dramaturgically, I wanted to have a show which would look very different than, for example, the minimal show or the just only light strings show, And so it was just about trying to produce like counterpoints. Like for me, his political. I found his politics sometimes like borderline naive or something. Like that's the issue that I would have with him, this kind of subversion. And like, I mean, he was also younger than we are now. Like I was thinking that earlier. Like he died younger than we are now, no? Although I still feel young, but, this whole kind of subversion, and what would he talk about? I can't even remember, but like all of this kind of subversive, and like also when you said like questioning authority, it's like, oh my God, just grow up, like and be responsible. Sorry, and is somebody gonna like quote me again on this? And like, I have to be careful what I say. Well, at least I got Richard to laugh. What do you say to that, Richard?
Keep going.
Yeah, okay. but like, so I wasn't necessarily interested in America as for my sake. Yeah, as maybe I also take up this role of a curator, but in terms of my own interest, I would just wanted to, like, if you wanted to show a changing process, it's not so interesting to show a changing process which goes from one state which is similar to the next state, which is similar to the next state. It's so interesting to go from one state which is very different to the next state, which is different to the. So that's how I needed to compose that in time, no?
But so why 7 shows?
No, I mean, I don't know. Was it even 7 or 6? I don't even know. But like to me, it was.
Well, it was 6 plus 1.
What was the +1?
Well, that's what I want you to talk about. But the last one, it seems, was one left in the hands of the installers.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, I kind of let them do what they wanted, no?
Yeah.
I forgot about that. Because I
but
never
it's
really
all
saw...
in the book.
Yeah. No, because I never really saw that, and I'm not sure they did a good job also. I mean, and that was honest, I'm not sure, that's not me, that's a German person speaking. It means like when I say I'm not sure they did a good job, it means it actually means that. It's like maybe they did do a good job, but I just didn't really see, it just didn't.
Because you couldn't be there every single day over the whole duration of the exhibition.
I think they shortcutted it through that a little bit. They were just like, let's go back to position 1.
But it's interesting even that in your conception of the exhibition, you had 6, which could have been 3 or it could have been 19, but 6 different versions of an exhibition that you constructed, that you sort of mastermind, and that you wanted one that would be for the people who were in the process of actually doing the work, that they would have full sort of control over what they would do.
It just comes out of the logic, I think, like, it comes out of the logic, like you explained very eloquently, out of the logic of his work, where it's all about this, like even, some of the most radical things that also Andrea explained to me then is like this, he has these portraits, which like the portraits are these kind of like, like white letters on black font, which have these like important dates in somebody's life, and it can be a political event, can be a very personal event, and like when you buy these works, apparently, like you can add yourself, like something to it, and like so this malleability, this transformability, that's really part of his whole worldview, let's say, and I agree with that. Like you're not the same person. And you evolve as a person, and maybe you need a different portrait. So here's an artist who's making a portrait which can somehow change. So I was just taking up, to answer your question, I was just taking up like what was in his work, but then you emphasized by like also each time doing 2 shows, like your version of the show, then having that. So I just continued that logic. Okay, then I did 6, and then okay, yeah, these art handlers who were like literally there every day, and obviously there's a number of artists. I think 2 of them are actually relatively known now. Yeah, I have to ask Anna Inhofe what they did. Like, I don't really know.
So I'm curious, and maybe the audience is too, to hear you speak about how you trained them, and how training them to install and deinstall and move around a Felix González Torres retrospective might be either different or the same from the way you would install, say, the people upstairs doing what they're doing at the Fondation Beyeler.
Yeah, I remember we had very little time, and basically, this also something I learned from Balanchine, the great ballet choreographer, Georges Balanchine. Like Balanchine says, like when you compose, you need to have, these kind of points of orientation, let's say, and then you can fill the gaps, to say it a bit vulgarly, and compose in between. And so also these 6 shows or 7 shows, they functioned as these kind of markers. And so basically, I made sure that they understood like what the 7 shows or 6 shows were, like, and we installed those. And then it was about like, let's say, transitioning from one to the other. So you have like, okay, show 1, and then I just let them do 1 at a time. So it wasn't micro-managed. I don't know if I told them exactly in which order they had to do it. I don't think so. Like in which order they had to kind of deinstall and reinstall the next show. I think they just did it room by room. So there was also all these like in-between states, really, because I think they would, so in a way, like it's actually not even true to say there was 6 shows, because you always had like some kind of wrong version of it at every moment, because there would always be 1 or 2 rooms which were already the next show,
But for instance, was there a script they followed? In a way, you've described a little that it was quite loose, but nevertheless, how did you draw out what each of the shows would be? Because we have some plans that are included in the book made after the fact based on what the shows look like, so that an audience who wasn't there can sort of figure out what each of the 6 shows looked like. But I'm just wondering how much the way you trained them is like the way you might trained performers to participate in other pieces of yours.
Honestly, I can't quite remember. I think they, I don't know how I made sure that these shows had names. Like there was for example, one which was called Curated 1 and one which was called Curated 2. That was like our internal lingua. So those were just like really diverse shows of González Torres. And I somehow made sure, I think I had a model and I would show them in the model, like what the show was. Maybe I even let them transform like it from one to the other on the model. So I was sure that they knew. But I can't remember how we did it. And then in terms of like their presence in the space, I neither encouraged them to kind of talk to people or something, nor did I say you can't talk to people, you shouldn't be phased, no? But in general, like they were really like working as art handlers. It was just that it was like happening during the show. It didn't give them much, it didn't give them many indications. I mean, they also knew how to be art handlers, which I don't know. So they did their job, no?
Well, one interesting thing was we were very nervous when we were preparing the book that maybe we wouldn't be allowed to document your 6+1 exhibitions because, as most people will know, Tino Sehgal's work cannot be documented photographically or in other ways. And I remember the conversation we had when I kind of nervously approached you about, well, you know, it would somehow be necessary to be able to have photographs of this, and you said, well, yeah, of course, this is not a work of Tino Sehgal. This is a Felix González Torres retrospective.
Yeah, still the same answer. Maybe we should open it up?
Yes.
Yeah, or did you?
You may have many questions. And
or
if you haven't read the nearly 700-page book yet,
with many photos. The most are of my show, because there were 7.
Indeed, I think there might be a microphone going around. Yes.
I guess this is working. Just a kind of, I have a million questions. He's my favorite artist ever. But a quick question was in the recent show at Warner, the press release didn't mention HIV or AIDS. And that sort of was a contentious topic, saying that the artist himself wished his biography to be part of the interpretation of the work. So I was interested, Tino, when you said that his personal life didn't interest the exhibition that you had, and what your take on sort of that question about should the kind of abjectness of AIDS and death be in the work?
I mean, when I said that earlier, like I think you know a lot of his work is about loss and death. No, like it's like, I mean, it's very obvious. You know, I mean, especially when you go more in depth into the work because you have to curate one. Like, I mean, these candy piles have the weight of a body mostly, or like around that, and then they slowly are diminishing. No, and so I think one can let the work speak for itself. When I said this, when I commented earlier, I said I'm not interested necessarily in his private life. It's because his private life always kind of shows up a little bit in these kind of parenthetical titles, you know? And I mean, personally, I'm interested in his, but as a curator, I don't need to emphasize that, you know? Like, it never really made sense to me, like, either your work is untitled or it's Ross is in LA, you know? What is it, you know? Like, and maybe I'm too square for that, but I was like, is it now untitled? I mean, it's both, but like, am I supposed to think about Ross in LA forever after? Like, that was his boyfriend, no? Like, I don't know, like, but obviously, like the question of death and the loss of his partner is, I think, very, very strong in the work, and I think that's where it's also, you know, the most striking.
Other questions? I might have another, maybe the last then. I would like to ask, sort of through the process of having worked on that exhibition, and maybe now even several years later, and the book is out, and it documents it, and maybe shows it in a way that you couldn't even have physically experienced it yourself. Are there things about Felix González Torres's work that you know now, or that you understand differently than you did before doing the project?
About his work?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course. I mean, what I said earlier, like, I wasn't aware. I mean, if you go as an exhibition goer, you're not aware that, like, how in most of his works he really tries to introduce this malleability or this transformability, like I was saying earlier about these portraits. Like that was a surprise to me, to see how he tried to insert this transformability just about everywhere. Like that you can, I also didn't fully know that, like, it's really up to you how you hang these light strings. You know, most of you might know these light strings, and it's again, like, what is the connection between like a kind of candy stack and a light string? It's like very different aesthetics in a way. But I mean, nowadays we think them together if we're like part of the art field because we know they're González Torres, but first of all, it's not really that similar. And for example, I really made a point also with the light strings. I did like all these weird knotted compositions with the lights, and I made them made like a kind of minimal composition with them in lines. I made like really kind of weird kind of post-minimal compositions, like knotting them up and binding them together. I mean, González Torres Foundation let me do that, but the reason I did that was it was also to show, like, yes, these same works can be shown in very, very different ways. You know, it's to have this weird knotted. I wouldn't be able to find a photo quickly right now, but like there are photos in there, these weird knotted constellations, and is obviously literally looks very different than. There's something also like there's one. It's not totally what I was talking about, but like they're also like around a stack or something, and then. So, I definitely.
I mean, you did many things that I would dare say maybe a professional curator wouldn't dare do. And that was the whole reason to ask an artist to work on the project, to do things because it's embedded in the work, because it's possible for the work. It wasn't that you were taking liberties that were not allowed. It was that you were taking exactly the liberties that Felix González Torres had left within the work, and just you were showing their true potential. But I would say before your show, I had only seen candy piles in certain ways. They were always neatly in a corner, or always neatly in a minimal square.
Yeah, I did a kind of Dali version, which I was surprised that the González Torres Foundation let me get away with.
Yeah, I don't.
Maybe we can find a photo of that, but it's gonna.
I mean, it looked like the shape of Africa, and you know, I had never seen a Felix González Torres candy pile that looked like that.
Yeah, but if you also think like, here it is. Yeah,
it is.
It's my kind of. You see the two clocks, and then this weird kind of lake or something. And I mean, to me, like, for example, if you think of his most famous work, it's probably these two clocks, you know, and the perfect lovers. Of course, you can say like that's not really malleable or transformable in itself, but again, it plays with this kind of. That's, one could say, something which is non-static, because at the end of the day, these clocks kind of go more and more out of sync. No, like you can see, like even the precision of a clock. So again, he's back with the same kind of obsession. No, and that's, I think, also mine. So
I had this almost like light bulb experience here at the Fondation Beyeler after the end of Carol Bove's show, where the two clocks were up at the entrance near the ticket desk, and I had installed it for my version of the show, so two ordinary clocks touching, set at the same time at the beginning of the exhibition, and then allowed to live their life, like two perfect lovers touching, but not the same, and one invariably comes out of sync with the other. and Carol Bove kept it for her version of the exhibition in the same place without having reset them. So by the end of the show, they were quite out of sync with each other. And I remember coming to, on the very last day, to the Fondation Beyeler and looking at them, and there was about 7 minutes difference between them or something. And I remember grabbing my phone to check the time because I thought, which is right of these two clocks? Which is telling me the correct time? And I had yet a different time on my clock, and I suddenly realized the whole of the show was about that, putting two things always next to each other, or in your case, 2 and then within 2, 7. And none of them would be the right or the definitive Felix Gonzalez stories. They would all be some version that would make you realize that none of them was whole and right and yeah, definitive, authoritative, but versions, interpretations.
Yeah, maybe one last thing. I think that you can say, like, to bring it to kind of a more like historical or philosophical perspective, like you can say that like most cultures in the history of humankind, they embrace the fact that like nothing is permanent. And you can say the West of the last, let's say the West of the Renaissance, or like since the Renaissance till now, as a culture, not necessarily only in art, but just as a culture, kind of is an experiment with the idea, like, let's make things permanent. But that's actually the more unusual idea. Like most cultures understand and know nothing is permanent. But we made an experiment, and museums are really important places for this experiment, that like, no, and we really fostered this belief, things are permanent. And they stay, and objects are static, but no object is static. Like if you read Alfred North Whitehead, like, you know, the kind of process philosopher of the 20th century, you know, like he'll talk about, like, obviously also a table is a process, you know, it's just such a slow process that you can't really, you know, on an atomic level, it's shifting. It's just so slow that it's kind of irrelevant to humans and their lifetime. And so Felix is somebody who really pokes into this kind of experimental belief of the West in the last few hundred years, because it's like, no, that was a nice try, but things are not permanent, and I know that. You know, I know that from my personal life, and I'm going to show that in my work. You know, it doesn't work like that on this planet.
Well, thank you. I think that's a beautiful way to end.